When we look at the levels of compliance that are offered by Amazon, we've got a lot of possibilities here that will match up with the compliance levels that you have to follow. Most compliance levels want multiple copies of data. Well, availability zones store EBS data volume backups with multiple copies of data. The regions and availability zones where you store your data, specifically S3 buckets, well, there's multiple copies of all files in S3 buckets. The Elastic File System, multiple copies of the data again. FSX, storage for Windows servers, multiple copies of the data automatically. And RDS databases, multiple copies of the database records with multiple storage locations, i.e., multiple availability zones. Amazon has this level of storage to match with your compliance levels. You also might have issues with sharing in the cloud, but it's pretty hard to run in the cloud without having some sharing. But perhaps your compliance levels say, I can't share my compute. So what I can do within my network locations at AWS, that's the VPC, the virtual private cloud, I can change or control the tenancy of the compute resources that are stored on my networks. I can say either shared or non-shared EC2 instances. It just depends on your compliance level, what you're trying to achieve. The types of network connections that I can utilize to match the compliance levels of what I need in order to operate in the cloud can either be an HTTP or HTTPS endpoint. You can also use private VPN connections. And as talked about, only S3 Glacier has encryption enabled and mandatory by default, but I can turn on data encryption for any data records that are stored at AWS. When we look at the levels of data encryption, S3 buckets, AES 256-bit encryption, I can enable it. RDS databases, depending on the flavor of database that you choose, there are a variety of encryption choices available. EBS volumes can be encrypted. The shared storage arrays, either EFS and FSX, also support AES 256-bit encryption. And customers can also utilize what's called client-side encryption, meaning that you encrypt it first and then you move the records up to AWS. That's kind of a foolproof way to encrypt things. You hold the keys. Amazon doesn't even have the keys. Finally, it's important to remember that any logs that I'm utilizing, they're data as well. And there is lots of logging that can go on. If I have what's called a trail when I'm using CloudTrail, that is a record of accessibility, what has happened in my AWS account. Those trails can be stored in S3 buckets. If they can be stored in S3 buckets, they can be encrypted. CloudWatch, the monitoring service, has logs of information. Those logs of information can be stored either within the CloudWatch logging service itself, or they can be stored in S3 buckets. You may be thinking, why always S3 buckets? Well, remember, S3 buckets have unlimited storage. You can't run out of storage. If I'm using an ELB load balancer, the logs can be enabled to track all the traffic from that load balancer. If I have networks, specifically VPC networks, I can enable what's called a flow log and capture the flow of network traffic throughout my networks. If I'm using S3 for storing resources, I can have logs as to the access to the buckets themselves and what was carried out, what process, whether it was deleted, whether it was put, whether it was moved. I've got a lot of information that can track what has happened within my data resources. So I can get a lot of information as to what's going well and not going well with all of my storage at AWS.